Hi everyone, my name is Maribel, and today we're going to be talking about an animal that have very pretty shells, they're very small, and they're very slimy too. Maybe you've seen it before? So today we're going to be talking about snails. We're going to learn more about them, what they like, what they dislike, and then we're going to build our own snail. So if we want to build the snail, we need to know what it looks like. So how would you describe a snail? What are some things you notice about the way it looks? So first is that snails are very, very small, usually. And they have very tiny features. So the mouth of a snail is hard to see from the human eye because of how tiny its body is. And snails are known for having these beautiful coiled shells on their backs. They also have two sets of tentacles. At the top of its head is where its eyes are, so it helps them to see in the light and in the dark. And then the two tentacles at the bottom of its mouth is where it smells. So that helps them to sense the world around them. And then snails also produce a slime at the bottom of their tail, which helps them to get around. So in the world, there are over 60,000 kinds of snails. Let's look at 3 of them. So first is the giant African land snail. That snail is actually the largest type of snail in the world. It can grow to be 20 centimeters long, which is roughly about the size of my palm, so they're huge. Now in contrast, we also have the garden land snail, which are very small, and if you've ever seen a snail before, you probably were looking at the garden land snail. They're some of the most common types of snails in North America. And lastly, we have the Roman snail. And they're special because the shells on their back are these beautiful, intricate colors, and they have a very heavy shell. So it's almost about 1/3 of its weight. So we know the largest snail, we know the most common snail, and we know the snail that has a very beautiful shell, the Roman snail. So, where do you normally see snails? Snails can live in all sorts of different kinds of environments. As long as it's not too warm and too dry, snails are able to adapt pretty well to most environments. So they can live in the forest, in water, in the soil, on the ground. Pretty much you can see snails everywhere you go, as long as it's not too hot or not too dry. So how many of you like cucumbers? Well, it turns out snails love cucumbers. It's their favorite food. But they also love to eat other kinds of vegetables, like lettuce, cabbage, mushrooms, and all sorts of different kinds of rotten materials. So if you were a gardener and you were planting a bunch of vegetables, do you think you would like the snails very much? No. They tend to eat a lot of the things that gardeners are trying to plant, which is why we spray our vegetables with pesticide. So snails don't like pesticide, so as long as you spray vegetables with this pesticide, then snails will stay away. So those are some things that snails like. So let's look at some things that snails don't like. So first we mentioned that they don't like temperature that's too hot or too dry. They're not a big fan of pesticide. And they also don't like being disturbed. So if you ever touch a snail, you'll notice that they tend to quickly coil up in their shell, which means they wrap their bodies so that they're hidden underneath their shell. Snails get very scared easily, so they don't like to be disturbed or touched. They also have an enemy. Roosters tend to eat snails, so snails tend to get very frightened of roosters. So they're not a big fan of roosters either. We know that snails love to eat all sorts of different kinds of vegetables, but there are some vegetables they don't like eating. Plants and herbs like mint that have a very strong smell are plants that snails prefer to stay away from. And they also don't like eggshells, cold coffee, or beer. So those are some things that snails dislike. Now let's look at the life cycle of the snail. How is it born and how does it grow up? So first, when a snail lays its eggs, it'll lay about a batch of 80 eggs. And the eggs are these tiny, pearly white eggs where the snail will be born from. A snail will lay about 6 batches of eggs in 1 year. So once the snail hatches, it'll become a young snail, and over time will grow up to be a full-grown adult snail. So that's everything we know about snails. We've talked about the different kinds of snails, what they like, what they dislike, and now we know what it looks like. We know how to describe a snail, so we can build our very own snail with the pieces we have in front of us. So let's get started on the build. Make sure you have all your pieces. And we're going to begin by taking first your 2x8 yellow brick, and you're going to take 2 of your red square pieces, and we're going to first build up the base of the snail's body. So we're going to start with the neck by taking 2 of your square pieces and just stack them on top of each other. So we have a tower, and you're going to place that on one end of your yellow 2x8 block. And we have first the entire tail of the snail, and we have its neck. So let's move on and add a head. Take a red square piece with the outward scoop, and that's going to be the head of our snail. So you're just going to want to attach that right on top of the neck we just made. So we have the tail of the snail, we have its neck and its head. What's the last thing we're going to need to make the snail? Of course, we're going to have to add a nice coiled shell. So to do that, take your 2x4 plate, so that's your blue piece, and you're going to place that right next to the neck of the snail. Once that's in, we want to add the coiled shell. So you're going to take your red semicircle piece, so that's the half circle shape, and this is going to be the shell to our snail. So just clip that right on top, in the middle of the snail's body. And now we want to finish up the tail of the snail by grabbing our last square piece. That's the square with the outward scoop. And you're going to place that right behind the shell of your snail. And that's it. We have our snail. We got the tail, the shell, its body, its head, and that's for the build. So let's go over today what we learned about snails. We learned that there are thousands of different kinds of snails in the world. We talked about 3 different kinds: the largest giant African land snail, we talked about garden snails, and we talked about the Roman snail. What are some other things you remember about snails? Do you remember what their favorite food was? They love plants and vegetables, but they especially love eating cucumbers. And what are some things that snails don't like? We mentioned that they're a common enemy with the rooster. They don't like herbs like mint with strong flavor. And all those snails live in all sorts of different environments. They can be in the ground, they can live in the water, they can live in forests or deserts. They don't like to live in temperatures that are too warm or too dry. What are some other things you remember that we talked about the snail? Well, that's it for today's build. Once you're done, you can go ahead and decorate your snail, or you can try building more snails. Just remember, having a long body and a shell will make the snail. So you can make a whole family of snails. You can try making a bigger snail. And that's it for today's build. Once you're done, make sure to put all your pieces away, and we will see you for the next build. Bye, everyone.